Hey guys, it's Matt here once again, and today I wanted to give you the wrap up on what was probably my highest DPS character thus far, at least in the usual context of no broken shit like poison or old ignite, or even some frost wall shenanigans with lightning arrow and kinetic blast. So it is the Reave and Blade Flurry Pathfinder Fizz to Ellie conversion using a fairly strong sword that I crafted and then a fairly strong Shaper stat stick in the offhand that I also crafted. So pretty much all of my gear is, fairly achievable. It's just on the higher end of what you would usually expect of a character, so it's somewhat overpowered, but definitely not broken, nothing anywhere near mirror quality, and definitely a lot of improvements that can be made. This is just kind of going to be displaying what a character can do when you put a bit more currency into it than I usually would. Usually my characters are anywhere from 2 to 5 exalts, let's just say, unless I get a 6 link randomly. This one's worth probably more like 10 to 20, depending on the sword price that you really would allocate. Now, the sword is incredible, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near worth paying as much as it is, so I wouldn't recommend going anywhere near this level of a sword unless you just happen to randomly craft it. So we're talking a good 2 to 5 exalt sword at best will get you very similar results, because my damage right now is completely overkill. That was me just trying to showcase what the build looks like with the Reave, the Inpulsa explosions, which I happen to find very nice. The Inpulsa chest, not at all necessary, it's just kind of for aesthetic purposes, and it is fairly useful. And now I do want to go into our single target damage, and that is with Blade Flurry. I've only got one Elder Guardian here to show you, red tier, because they're all the same. They all get completely destroyed in like half a second flat, and there's kind of no fight to really show you. Now, I did do all of this stuff with Reave as well, and Reave does it equally as fast because this content just melts to the level of DPS that we have, but Blade Flurry is of course going to be more because it's something like 3 times more damage than Reave, and there's absolutely no reason to not just sub out 2 gems. That is Reave for Blade Flurry and Multi-Strike for Maim or melee, or full damage on full life rather. That's all it takes. It's just 2 quick gem swaps and then you triple your damage for these big boss fights. So there's no reason to not do it unless you just really stubbornly want to go Reave. You can still by all means do that, but it's kind of just silly because you are missing out on a lot of extremely higher damage in the same sort of character gear scenario circumstance. And then I do want to show you all the Guardians, and this tier 16 over here, Chimera, was basically the fastest and most efficient, effective Chimera run I've ever done. I've never been able to purely kill all of the adds that spawn as they spawn, and then bounce around to the ad spawns and kill them instantly before they even get a chance to do anything. It was completely ridiculous. It was the fastest run I've ever done, and also extremely safe. And as well as that, you may notice that I have flasks up basically all of the time, or ready to go for whenever I need them, and that is a huge perk of being a Pathfinder. So with the Pathfinder perks, basically I'm rarely even needing to press all of my flasks rather than just the diamond, but when I do press the diamond and a few other flasks, they will come back up almost immediately thanks to the Pathfinder buffs, and then you can just maintain flasks as long as you want and for whatever you want. So quite often I am pressing all of my flasks for these ad phases, sometimes just the diamond flask to get rid of the enfeeble off the map, since I have a curse immune diamond flask. Overall though, it's just a really comfortable playstyle, and it really lets you kind of not worry too much about your sustain. And at this point I've got a bit of life leech from the Vitality Void cluster, but my sustain is rarely coming from life leech and mostly just my life flask. And here is an example of the Chimera fight with a princess sword. So we're talking a level 10 leveling weapon, and it was just used and done here as an example to make sure that I could still do it with much weaker items. And this weapon is completely terrible for our build, considering we want a pretty large amount of physical. So I'm saying that a 5-10C weapon will definitely clear you the game if you still have similar other stuff. because the build itself is just somewhat strong. Blade Flurry itself is just somewhat strong, so it's not entirely about my weapon. I end up doing this fairly deathless chimera and can easily do the rest of the game with just the princess, but then we're back into our real weapon just to showcase some more of the damage and some more of the boss killing potential. Over here is a Phoenix which had a few nasty mods on it. I do slip Conk Effect into the Blade Flurry sometimes for certain fights. This one I didn't particularly like Conk Effect because it's a lot harder to kill the Phoenixes on, but I still used it and then just bounced around and had to kill them a little bit harder than usual. The damage is still pretty insane, and with the right mods you don't really want to do too much face tanking, so it is a bit of a jumping around fest. Minotaur, well, I will let this speak for itself. Ridiculous. That is with damage on full life, so I was on full life most of the time. Won't always happen, so I don't always use damage on full life. I will sometimes use maim when I think I'm going to be taking plenty of damage. I believe I use damage on full life here, but it's a 70% monster life Hydra, so it was a little slower than usual. And then we're on to the big boy himself, Shaper. I do believe I use damage on full life for this guy, and it's not necessarily the right move. You could definitely do maim, because we do take some damage every now and again, but as long as you're topped off and use a life flask at the right times, the right moments, well, you can just about global Shaper and every other Guardian out there. My DPS, as I said, is extremely crazy on this build. I do have a 400 DPS weapon though. It was crafted by myself, so what are you going to do? I'm going to use it. I don't, however, have an abyssus. If you don't have that high of a budget and you really want huge DPS, an abyssus will easily bring you past my DPS level. You would just have to rearrange your tree a bit and maybe get a taste of hate instead of a lion's roar. But I didn't really want to spend any currency on taste of hate, and I really didn't want to have to deal with the downsides of abyssus this time around. So that's entirely up to you guys. You could definitely get more damage or bridge the gap of the weapon that I have with a much weaker weapon plus the abyssus, because abyssus is 50% more damage from my current character just in the one helm slot. And over here I'm just showcasing a bit of the Blade Flurry clear speed, because this character can be entirely Blade Flurry if you really choose to do that. The Inpulsa explosions do help quite a bit with your clear speed, but it's really a no-brainer to use Reave for the full clear speed effect. It's just that Blade Flurry it's kind of a little bit slow on the area, but it definitely is playable if you really don't mind that much. And then Uber Eats I have over here, just I've never had such crazy damage, I don't think. It is pretty insane when you get your Blade Flurry stacks rolling, and if you pop some flasks, just how quickly you can kill this shit. So the actual Ziri's clones take something like 1 hit to actually die. I've never been so safe against these. They don't really have a chance to do absolutely anything. So that is pretty much all of the fights there. I will now go over the character's gear and how I built it, I suppose, because it's pretty straightforward, I'd say. Now, up until this point, it has been kind of tough to pick a favorite character, but I'm gonna have to say this is probably the one. It is a level 92 Pathfinder, and just for sheer power, speed, and also aesthetics based off of the Impulses, I'd have to say it's been my most enjoyable character of the league. So the Impulses does give that shock explosion with the blue tinge to anything you shock and then kill. And since half of my damage is lightning, at least half or so, we do shock things very reliably every time we crit, and then we cause those explosions. So it's not really the greatest chest for the build, I wouldn't say, because it doesn't really give you too much except for the aesthetics. It does give a bit of damage and a bit of life, but a Belly of the Beast, for example, would put you at 6,300 life instead of 5,600, which is definitely a choice you can make if you want to be a bit tankier. Maybe an Elder chest for more damage. There's plenty of other choices you can go, but for the aesthetics, for the fun, I think this was the right move. And besides that, it was just a very strong character overall, using Blade Flurry and Reave, which are two of the favorites so far these days. And yeah, it was fun crafting a offhand scepter with a bit of alterations and regals, and ultimately the best I could do is just this 40 fizz as fire, some elemental damage, and the penetration base. So it's nothing insane. This one's very, kind of weak as to compared to what you could actually get. Ultimately, get some chaos spam happening, and I think this is what I landed on. Only took me about 100 chaos to craft 2 of these types of scepters, so I've got another one that looks exactly like that. And the rest of the gear, nothing too insane either. It's mostly just the sword. So the sword, as I may have mentioned before, ended up rolling this with alterations and regals, hit it on the Corsair, got the tempered and then the attack speed, regaled the physical damage, and then started exalting some crap. But basically, you don't need anything anywhere near this insane. A 300, 330 sort of sword as a Corsair will definitely be able to clear the entire game fairly comfortably. It's just that I crafted a really nice one and I wanted to make use of it. So to give you an example, here is my current damage. It's 2.2 million against Shaper with all of my realistic buffs. I will sometimes have frenzies because I do have my own frenzy charge generation through frenzy, sometimes blood rage. So it's up to you whether or not you want to tick that, because not all the time, as you'll see in some of those clips, will I have frenzies, but some of the times I will. So if you want to tick that, 2.8 million, that's a lot more, but I'm just keeping it modest, and a lot of the time I won't have it, so 2.2. Now that's with my current sword. If you have a much more realistic weapon, I'm talking just hitting a tyrannical or a merciless and then multi-modding from there on out, which is very realistic if you're getting into this sort of a market, you drop down to 1.8 million. Now that's by no means a deal breaker. That is still going to be able to clear the rest of the game quite easily, and my damage right now is, as you saw throughout those clips, overkill. It's just completely stupid and not really necessary at all. It's just that if you craft something like this, well, no reason to not use it. Now I will go over the rest of the gear. So these boots I had, I've used on plenty of other characters, except this time I ended up exalting them and getting 20 movement speed. I only used this movement speed for the last couple of levels, and it's not relevant on this character at all, because I'm just leap slamming almost everywhere. So bear in mind, you don't need movement speed on your boots. You can go combs if you really want, but I definitely needed resists in mine. So resist, life, some strength, and that's how we try and fill out most of our resists and a bit of life from the boot slot. As always, Tomb Fist, 2 socket. Don't really need 2 sockets specifically. 1 socket will be totally fine, because I'm just using, well, some pretty weak jewels, to be honest. So this one has some life and a bit of LE damage to attacks, which you really don't want. You want physical damage to attacks, and you also want attack speed, crit multi, that sort of stuff. So this one specifically hardly adds any damage to the table. And then I also got a Searching Eye just because I wanted to maim things, but the maim doesn't really give you any extra damage, just a bit of a quality of life for well, slowing things down. So life, attack speed on crit, and likewise over here we have some life, attack speed on crit, and LE damage to swords. As I mentioned though, the LE damage rolls, they're really pretty weak for the build, especially when you're scaling this much fizz. So keep that in mind when you're looking for your own abyssal jewels. Then got a belt with some life, resists, reduced flask charges, and LE damage to attacks. Crafted my own helm, bought a enchant over here, 150% effect buff granted by Ice Golem. He's not always going to be up, but you do have to resummon him quite often, and he will be up for a lot of the fights, so it's a bit of an active playstyle to have any sort of buff there. The only other buff I could really think about is Blade Flurry damage or Blood Rage attack speed, so not anything terribly important. Don't really have to have a helm enchant. And then I managed to chaos spam this helmet, which you're really just looking for life and some resists. Otherwise, starkonja or abyssus if you don't think you need any of that. For then, we have some physical damage is very important in your amulet and your rings. So physical damage, crit multi, then some life and strength, resists, other stats. Whatever you can get. Some LE damage to attacks is really good too. This is just my generic amulet that I've been using for a lot of different builds, but for the most part, fizz and crit multi. And then I basically used my rings to try and cap out my Wise Oak, because my Wise Oak is triple balanced, giving me 15 pen and 10 reduction across the board. So I did that mostly with my rings. So I was, fairly somewhat balanced without the rings. I then went out and bought a couple that would suit my exact needs and tried to get a little bit of life, bit of accuracy, bit of fizz damage. So that's what these 2 rings are, and they're really nothing special. Didn't pay too much for either of them, and that's the purpose they served in the build. So that's all of the gear covered. My aura, hatred, definitely the thing of choice because you need for quite a lot of damage from our physical, and then Herald of Ash as well, quite a lot of damage coming from our physical too. Running, so that's those 2 sitting here, running an Ice Golem, an Ancestral Protector for some attack speed buff, so keep him up whenever you can. Reave, purely to get extra Reave stacks happening. If you don't know how it works, Reave can currently have 4 maximum stacks. When you use Reave, you can double that and get 8 maximum stacks, and you'll keep those stacks going for as long as you're attacking. So every Reave build basically has to use Reave, and you are missing out on a lot of area if you are not using it. Then we have Blood Magic, Faster Attacks, Leap Slam, and Fortify. Over here we have Immortal Call, Vile Haste, Cast when damage taken, and Increased Duration. And down here is Blood Rage, Frenzy, and Fortify. And that is purely for my Frenzy on the left-hand click to occasionally get Frenzies whenever I have time and whenever I think I need to. And then for the main setup, for the most part, I'll just grab my Reave real quick. So we're sitting here. The main setup I'm running with is Reave, melee fizz damage, elemental damage with attacks, and fizz to lightning. We then incorporate multi-strike, and at this stage I'm using crit strikes almost all of the time, and those are the ones that can be changed throughout the build. So that is Reave, crit strikes, and multi-strike. To actually go full Blade Flurry, you just take out Reave and you take out multi-strike, and most of the time I'm fitting in maim for the extra physical damage. Some of the time I'm filling in damage on full life, and then some of the time I'm getting rid of crit strikes for conk effect for the max damage. But a lot of the time this is the Blade Flurry setup, and a lot of the time this is the Reave setup. Rarely, if ever, am I using area. Rarely in the Reave am I using conk effect. And yeah, you can play around with those and figure out the best setup. Now, basically, that is all going to be cataloged over here in the path of building, and you will be able to see all of that damage. You can see that the Wise Oak with the triple balance, because path of building will show you the triple balance, is worth a good chunk of damage here, good 300,000 in our current setup. Taste of Hate would be, somewhat competitive, and it's just a bit more expensive, but it's not very good damage. Actually, I'll check for you guys right now. So here you go, Taste of Hate. It is a bit less, and it's not a perfect Taste of Hate, so it's about 100,000 less, but it is a bit more defensive. The problem is an actual triple balanced Wise Oak is very defensive with that 10 reduction to each element. It's probably only something you'd maybe do instead of a Lion's Roar, because it can be annoying to use Lion's Roar. The big problem is it's a lot of damage for our build. 2.2 mil, take out Lion's Roar, it's 500k. Taste of Hate is not going to come close to replacing that. Not even actually going to do anything, because it ruins our Wise Oak balance for the other 2 resists. So if you incorporate Taste of Hate into the build, you're going to have to then balance your resists around always having Taste of Hate up, and that's a little annoying, and you won't always have it up. There will be some times when you don't. So bear that in mind. I always use Lion's Roar, even though it can be annoying, but it's entirely up to you guys. So I'll link you guys all of that if you want it. And yeah, I do recommend Reave. I do recommend Blade Flurry. Both the physical and the physical to elemental versions, Pathfinder or Gladiator, they're going to have very similar results, and they're going to be extremely strong. This was the strongest version I've ever built though, and it was a complete face roll, and it was very fun to play. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and the build. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.